Hey everyone, and welcome back to Tell Me More Stories Told as podcast. Today we're diving deep into a story that, you hear the name, you think, oh, how boring interest rates. But believe me, this Libor scandal is anything but. It's a story of deception and greed and a system that let down millions. And to help us break it all down, we've got a financial expert with us today. Welcome. Ready to jump into this mess.
Absolutely. This is one of those stories that, really makes you question the whole system.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. What exactly is Libor?
Well, Libor stands for the London Interbank Offered Rate. It's basically a daily average of interest rates that banks say they'd have to pay to borrow from each other.
So like a financial temperature check.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not just one number. There are actually like over 150 different Libor rates for different currencies, different loan lengths. The whole thing gets pretty complex.
I'm starting to see where the cracks could appear. But we're talking about big banks, right?
Yeah.
Why would they risk everything to mess with Libor?
Well, you have to remember there are always two sides to every coin. On one side, there's good old-fashioned greed. Even tiny changes to these rates could mean huge profits for traders.
So just trying to squeeze out a few extra bucks?
Sometimes, yeah. But there's this whole other side to it, too. Remember the 2008 financial crisis?
Oh, yeah.
Well, during that time, banks were absolutely terrified of looking weak. A high Libor submission, that could signal they were having trouble borrowing money. And that could, lead to a loss of confidence, even a bank run.
Oh, wow. So they're manipulating Libor to hide their own problem.
Exactly. They were basically putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound, hoping no one would notice.
This is unbelievable. It's like a house of cards built on lies.
And what's crazy is there were warning signs early on. Back in 2008, the Wall Street Journal, they hinted at potential manipulation. Even economists like Con Snyder and Thomas Ewell, they published studies supporting those claims.
So people were raising flags, but no one was listening.
Well, some were. This is where it gets really interesting. Some central banks, the very institutions responsible for stability, they knew about these Libor discrepancies. But they didn't take immediate action.
Wait, hold on. They knew these rates, which affect trillions of dollars, were being potentially rigged, and they did nothing.
It's complicated. Some say they were afraid to upset things during the crisis. Others think they just didn't grasp how big the problem was. But whatever the reason, their inaction played a key role in this whole mess.
This is mind-blowing. So we have banks manipulating a key financial benchmark for profit and to hide their weaknesses. And we have regulators who knew something was wrong but didn't act. It's like a recipe for disaster.
And in 2012, that's exactly what happened.
Okay, before we get into that explosion, I want to remind everyone, if you're enjoying this deep dive into the Libor scandal, make sure to hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss the next part of this story.
Yeah.
So 2012, what happened then?
Well, that's when things went south for Barclays, one of the world's biggest banks. They got hit with a massive fine, over $400 million for, well, you guessed it, manipulating Libor. And the kicker, they admitted to it.
Wow, they didn't even try to fight it. What exactly were they doing with these Libor submissions?
They were basically playing both sides, sometimes pushing rates up to make money on their trades, other times pushing them down to make the bank look healthier than it really was, especially during the crisis.
So they were manipulating the system for their own gain, and everyone else was in the dark.
Yeah, and the public outrage was, it was huge. Barclays admitting to messing with a system that affected trillions of dollars, it completely shattered people's trust in the financial world.
I can imagine this wasn't just some abstract financial concept, right? Real people were impacted by this.
Absolutely. Think about all those homeowners with adjustable rate mortgages. Those rates are often tied to Libor.
So if Libor was inflated artificially,
homeowners ended up paying more, way more than they should have. Some might have even lost their homes because of it.
that's awful.
Yeah.
And on the other side, investors in certain financial products, they could have lost out too when Libor was manipulated downwards.
Right. Pension funds, municipalities, even regular people who invested in things like interest rate swaps. It affected everyone.
It's like someone was messing with the foundation of our financial system and no one even knew. And to think, Barclays wasn't the only one doing this.
Oh no, not even close. As investigators started digging deeper, they uncovered this whole web of lies that spanned the globe. This wasn't just a few rogue traders. It was like cartel-like behavior.
Cartels, like something out of a movie.
You could say that. One of the most shocking pieces of evidence came from instant messages between traders at the Royal Bank of Scotland.
RBS.
Yeah, and these weren't subtle hints or anything. These were blatant conversations about moving Libor rates for profit. They even called themselves a cartel.
Wow, so they knew exactly what they were doing. Was it all about greed, or were there other things at play?
I mean, profit was definitely a big motivator. Some of the messages actually show traders bragging about how much money they were making by messing with Libor. But it wasn't always just about lining their own pockets. Sometimes it was about protecting their banks, especially after 2008.
Right, because a bank's LIBOR submission, that was supposed to reflect how trustworthy they were, right? So a high rate could make them look risky.
Exactly. And it's crazy because this wasn't just happening in secret. We're talking about traders at different banks communicating openly, almost like it was normal.
It's pretty disturbing how blatant they were. Did anyone inside these banks ever try to stop it?
Well, there were definitely whispers, people raising concerns, but for a long time, those concerns were ignored or brushed aside. It wasn't until the investigations really got going that the full scope of the problem became impossible to ignore.
It's incredible. We've talked about Barclays, RBS. Were
Yeah.
there any other big players involved?
Oh, yeah. UBS, another huge bank, they got hit with a $1.5 billion fine for their role in all of this. And remember those instant messages we talked about? Well, UBS took it a step further. They were actually caught bribing brokers to help them manipulate Libor.
Bribery. Are you serious?
Yeah, it's all there in the transcript. There's one quote that really sticks out. A UBS trader straight up offers a bribe, saying, if you keep this rate unchanged, I'll pay you whatever you want. It's mind-boggling that this kind of corruption was happening at such a high level.
It sounds like something out of a movie. So how widespread was this scandal? It sounds like it was much bigger than just a few banks.
Oh, absolutely. This wasn't just an isolated incident. It was global. Over 20 major banks from all over the world were investigated. These were institutions that were considered the cornerstones of the financial world.
It's hard to even grasp the ripple effects of all this manipulation. Did any individuals face consequences, or was it just the institutions getting fined?
Well, there were definitely some high-profile resignations. Bob Diamond, the CEO of Barclays, he stepped down. And the calls for stricter regulations for more oversight of the banking industry, those became much louder.
It sounds like the LIBOR scandal was a real wake-up call for the entire financial system.
It was. It exposed how vulnerable a system built on trust and self-regulation could be. It forced regulators to completely rethink how these benchmarks, these critical benchmarks, were set and overseen.
But it goes even deeper than just LIBOR, doesn't it?
Unfortunately, yes. Remember how we talked about central banks knowing about potential problems early on? Well, one bank was actually found to be exploiting the very system that was supposed to be rescuing banks during the crisis. Lloyds Banking Group, a major UK bank, they were fined over $200 million for manipulating not just LIBOR, but also the rates used to set prices for emergency loans from the Bank of England.
Wow, that's just adding insult to injury. Exploiting a system designed to help banks during a crisis is a whole other level of messed up.
It was a huge betrayal of trust, and the fines kept coming. Deutsche Bank, one of the biggest banks in Germany, they ended up paying a record $2.5 billion in fines for their involvement in the Libor scandal.
A record $2.5 billion. That must mean they were really deeply involved. What exactly did they do?
The investigation revealed a culture of, well, a culture where profit came before everything else, at least within certain parts of Deutsche Bank. They found that at least 29 employees had engaged in illegal activities related to Libor. And what's even more concerning is that the bank itself had found signs of this internally, but they didn't take any real action to stop it.
So it wasn't just a few rogue traders. It sounds like there was a systemic failure of oversight and accountability at multiple levels.
Exactly. The Libor scandal showed how a culture where breaking the rules was seen as acceptable as long as it meant more profits could take root. And the regulations in place at the time, they just weren't strong enough to prevent or even detect this kind of widespread abuse.
We've talked about the fines, the resignations, the calls for reform.
Yeah.
But what about the human cost of this scandal? This wasn't just some abstract financial game. These actions had real consequences for real people.
Absolutely. Remember those adjustable rate mortgages we talked about?
Uh,
Well, if LIBOR was artificially inflated, it meant homeowners were paying more than they should have been. Some might have even lost their homes because they couldn't keep up with the payments.
That's heartbreaking. And on the other hand, investors who were relying on LIBOR-linked products, they could have lost out when those rates were manipulated downwards.
Right. Pension funds, municipalities, regular people who had invested in things like interest rate swaps. They were all potentially affected. Those losses could have impacted retirement savings, public services, people's ability to reach their financial goals.
It's like a poison that spreads throughout the entire financial system, harming people who might not even realize they're being affected.
That's a good way to put it. And beyond the direct financial impact, there was also a huge loss of trust in the banking industry, in the whole financial system.
I can imagine. It's hard to trust a system when you know the numbers are being rigged to benefit those in power.
Right. The Libor scandal really shook people's faith in the integrity of financial markets. It raised serious questions about who was really in control, who was holding the reins.
So what's the lasting impact of the Libor scandal? Did it fundamentally change how financial markets operate?
It definitely left a mark. Regulators around the world took notice, and they implemented a whole bunch of reforms to try to prevent something like this from happening again. But the question is, have we done enough?
Welcome back to Tell Me More Stories Told as podcast. We're wrapping up our deep dive into the Libor scandal. And, well, it's been quite a ride, hasn't it?
It really has. It's shown us just how fragile trust can be, especially when it comes to the world of finance.
We've seen how this seemingly simple interest rate benchmark was manipulated, sometimes for profit, sometimes to hide vulnerabilities, especially during that 2008 financial crisis.
And we've talked about how those actions had real consequences for homeowners, for investors, for everyone.
Right, from Barclays and UBS to Rabobank and Deutsche Bank, we've seen how institutions, some of the biggest names in finance, were caught up in this web of deceit.
Paying billions in fines, facing public outrage, it was a reckoning for the industry.
But the story doesn't end there. After the dust settled, what happened? Did the financial world actually learn from its mistakes?
Well, there was definitely a push for change. The Libor scandal triggered a whole wave of reforms.
Like what?
Well, for one, oversight of Libor was taken away from the banks themselves.
Makes sense. No more foxes guarding the henhouse.
Exactly. And there were new rules put in place, aimed at increasing transparency, making sure records are kept properly, basically trying to make it much harder to manipulate the system.
So, problem solved.
Well, not so fast. The real question is, did those reforms actually address the root cause of the problem?
Which was?
That inherent conflict of interest. You see, the banks, the very institutions that stood to gain from manipulating Libor, they were the ones setting it in the first place.
So even with all these new rules, the potential for manipulation was still there.
That was a big concern. And that's why there's been this global push to find alternative benchmarks, ones that are more transparent, less susceptible to, well, to human greed, I guess you could say.
So what are the contenders? What's going to replace Libor?
Well, in the U.S., one of the leading alternatives is called SOFR, the Secured Overnight Financing Rate.
SOFR.
Yeah. It's based on actual transactions, real deals happening in the overnight repurchase agreement market, so it's much more robust, much more transparent.
So instead of relying on what banks say they could borrow at, SOFR looks at what they're actually borrowing at.
Exactly. And because it's based on such a large and liquid market, it's much, much harder for any single institution to manipulate.
That does sound like a major improvement. Are other countries doing something similar?
Oh, absolutely. The UK has developed SONIA, the Sterling Overnight Index Average, and other countries are working on their own replacements too. There's a global recognition that we need a better system, a system we can trust.
So is Libor dead?
It's on life support. Most Libor rates were actually discontinued at the end of 2021.
Oh, wow.
But a few key US dollar Libor rates, those were extended to June 2023, just to give everyone more time to transition to the new benchmarks.
So after all of this, after all the investigations, the fines, the reforms, what are the key takeaways from the Libor scandal? What lessons should we carry with us as we as we try to navigate the complexities of finance?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway, the one that really sticks with me, is the importance of transparency and accountability. We need systems that are robust, that are reliable, that can't be easily gamed. We can't just rely on trust and good intentions.
And we can't let institutions police themselves. That's one of the biggest lessons from the Libor scandal, right?
Absolutely. The Libor scandal showed us just how dangerous those conflicts of interest can be. They can undermine even the most well-established systems.
It's also a reminder of just how interconnected the global financial system really is. What happens in one part of the world can have ripple effects everywhere.
Exactly. And it highlights the critical role that regulators play in ensuring that the system is fair, that it's stable, that it works for everyone, not just a select few.
So as we move forward, we need to stay vigilant. We can't let the lessons of the Libor scandal fade away.
I agree. We need to keep pushing for more transparency, for stronger regulation, for a financial system that serves everyone.
Well said. This has been a fascinating and at times a pretty disturbing look into the world of finance. Thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your insights.
It was my pleasure.
And to all of you listening, thank you for joining us on this journey. Remember to stay curious, keep asking questions, and never take anything for granted, especially when it comes to the world of money. Until next time.